Following our last video on how we might make music theory more accessible to more people, this is the first in a new series of videos focusing on various aspects of composing, primarily intended for new or newish composers, and especially those who come at it with a more intuitive approach, but really it could be for anybody who's interested. We were going to start today with counterpoint, but I thought that actually a better place to start on this would be register, because register was where I made my first mistakes as a composer, and it's where I got my first big feedback, and it really changed how I approach composing in a very, very big way right at the very start. It's a long process, and I'm still learning more about it, but in this video I'm hoping to share a lot of what I have learned over this past year, and I hope it will be helpful. We're not trying to teach anything here. You know, I'm still just about in my first year of composing, so I'm nowhere near being qualified to teach anything. And even if I was, it probably wouldn't be my chosen medium for getting things across. Instead, it's more of me sharing some of the things that I've learned, some of the mistakes that I've made, and how so far I've tried to overcome those mistakes. And we'll be using some of the pieces that I've written over the past year as examples for how things could go wrong and how they could be improved. We're not using my pieces because there's anything great about them. It's because actually quite the opposite, because there's a lot of mistakes in them, especially in the early pieces, a lot of things that didn't work very well that can be used to illustrate how we can improve. And also I own the copyright to these pieces, so it makes sense from that point of view as well. When I hear music, whatever genre it's in, I tend to sort of mentally add additional layers to it, maybe small melodic fragments that keep going over the top. And so when I came to composing, I thought it would be quite easy, because all I'd need to do is keep adding these additional layers and get a really big, satisfying sound. And when I came to my first piece last July, that's what I started to do. I started to add layer upon layer upon layer, and I was actually really pleased with it, and I thought I'd done really well. But I just listened back to that piece in preparing this video for the first time for many months, and I'm actually surprised at how bad it is, and particularly in its use of register. In this part that we're about to look at, let's start by isolating the string bed, which is actually really badly harmonized, and that's not for now. We'll explain more about what's wrong with the harmonization in a later video on counterpoint or harmony, but you'll probably see it for yourself as well. It's a violin, viola, and a double bass doubled with a tuba. And then a couple of trombones come in, one of them playing unrealistically high. We'll see in a moment that this was already really problematic, but then I went in and added more layers, starting with the clarinet playing the main tune. Finally, an English horn. There's also some very quiet staccato string notes playing in the background, but these are not showing, else it would just look too cluttered. Can you see the problem? Look at this big cluster of different parts, especially around the middle register. This has the effect of muddying the sound and blurring different parts of it into each other. This was my first lesson in register, that the individual lines need some space to breathe. They need space around them, otherwise they'll all blur into each other and the whole sound will be really saturated. It wasn't quite as bad as it could have been in this piece, because the different textures of some of the instruments help them to stand out a little bit, but it is still really bad. To illustrate, let's hear just the viola, clarinet and lower trombone. See how badly they overlap and how difficult it is to hear any of them individually with clarity. It sounds like a grating, incoherent mess, so it's difficult to listen to. If it had been better spaced out, it would have had a much crisper sound and the lines would have been much more easily discernible. I received this feedback from a number of different people, but it didn't make much sense to me at the time. I was just very impressed that I was able to finish my first classical piece and I was very happy with it, and I didn't hear anything wrong with it. So just as with anything in life, when you're given an opportunity to solve a problem and you don't take it, the problem just keeps coming back bigger and bigger. And the next month I wrote my first string quintet. Fortunately, that was a lot simpler. There was a lot more space between the lines. There were fewer instruments. There was less room for clashes. But listen to this short extract and see if you can hear what problem still remains. There's a lot more space, there's fewer instruments, but look again at the mid-register. The viola and cello are clashing here again. Let's hear just those two instruments alone. Again, it sounds horrible. They just merge into each other. And that's not the only problem. Look at this huge space between the very high violin and anything else. It makes the top violin sound shrill and thin, like it's screeching, and there's nothing just below it to add more texture to it. There's also a lot of space between the mid-register and the bass, but that's not so bad. The way that sound resonates, lower parts need much more space around them, else they start to sound muddy. And so it's often okay to leave much more space between the bass and the next highest part, but we'll go into that in a lot more detail in other videos. Somebody gave me the feedback on this piece. You can obviously hear the lines, but can you hear the space between the lines? And I found this to be really cryptic and abstract, and I was even a little bit annoyed by it. And it took me a lot of time and more mistakes to understand that what he was getting at was this point about needing to give enough space around, above and below each line, especially if the lines are doing different things, so that they can be discerned from each other. Eventually I was able to just start to incorporate the beginnings of some of these ideas. In October I wrote my fourth string quintet. Yeah, I was doing a lot of string quintets at the time, but these early ones were very, very short, and they were more experiments in putting string music together. And you can see that this one is getting a little bit better. The parts are much more spaced out, but notice that there's still quite a lot of closeness between the second violin and the first viola, and then later between the second viola and the cello. The closeness of the parts is much less of a problem in this piece than it was in the earlier ones, for a couple of reasons that I was learning about at the time. One is that in the upper registers, it's easier to discern pitches even if they're a bit closer together. That's because there's fewer harmonic overtones up there. It's just how frequencies work. So we hear sounds as if they're more precise than lower down the register. And then in the lower register between the viola and the cello, this is also okay in this context. If I was wanting the voices to be distinguished and to be heard as separate individual lines, it would have been problematic because they wouldn't have been distinguishable from each other. It would have been just the same as in the earlier examples. But in this context, what I was aiming for was more about harmonization. I wasn't trying to have independent lines, so it was less important if the registers are closer together and not distinguishable. It might even have had a better effect for what I wanted at the time. So by this time I was feeling more confident, I was learning more, and I was starting to feel as I got register under my belt. But then I came across this really important video from David Bruce about register, and it really opened my eyes to the fact that there was much more to register than I thought there was. There are many more considerations around register than how the instruments are spread out. For example, how is the entire range of available register used at any time? Why is it a good idea to sometimes leave one part of the register completely empty and then to fill it again? What about the individual ranges of the individual instruments? For example, a cello will sound very, very different at low C and at middle C, or at middle C a violin and a bassoon will sound very, very different because of their respective registers. So many questions were raised, and I highly recommend watching this video because it taught me so much about register. And after seeing it, I started to experiment with some of its ideas. So for example, in my fusion quartet in March, I set myself the task of exploring register, and in particular the registral range of the individual instruments. In this section, for example, I was exploring the different sound of the bassoon in its different ranges. So here it repeats its phrase 3 times, an octave lower each time, bringing out its really different texture at each register. And in terms of looking at the available register as a whole and using it to best effect, at first the bassoon was playing only against the Indian harp at the top. But as it gets lower down, each time it goes lower, a new instrument is added. So first it's the violin, and then the oboe came in to occupy the space vacated by the bassoon. I feel like this awareness of register and what I was exploring with it has really helped my composing over the past few months. And it's also important to remember that there are times when you might intentionally want to do something a bit different. So, for example, in this section of my latest piece, Themes for Orchestra, I deliberately kept all of the parts in a relatively narrow registral space because I wanted more of that dense feel to the piece. Notice also how, taking a cue from David Bruce, in bar 54 the bass fades out, leaving the lower register entirely empty, so that when it returns, even quite low in bar 59, it feels like the music's expanding downwards into a new register. And especially in the next bar, when the flute comes in and it has that expansive upwards feeling as well, it gives a much fuller sense to what you're listening to. So these are just some reflections on register that I've gathered in my first year or so of composing. It's still the start of my journey. I'm sure I've got a lot more to learn, and maybe in another year's time, or 2 years maybe, we'll come up with a more advanced series, building on what we've learned in this series about register today, and the other aspects, and sort of taking it to the next level depending on what I learn over the next couple of years. Next time, for the next video in this series, we'll probably come finally to counterpoint. But we're going to take a bit of a break from this series next month because I'll be celebrating my first year as a composer. And I'll be putting out a different video on some of the overall lessons I've learned in terms of approaching music, approaching composition and so on, as something a little bit different. So see you then.